those who are online, including the robots. I am going to ask you to do a bit of, to help me out at various times in terms of thinking about ancient and modern connections. But to start, so the Hippocratic Treatise as Water Spaces is perhaps the founding text of environmental medicine. The author explains how living bodies in health and disease are all crucially shaped by climate, topography, and water sources. And it's certainly one of the most influential of the Greek medical texts that were composed around 400 BCE and later attached to the name of Hippocrates of Kos, the sort of legendary founding father of learned Greek medicine. We can trace it being read, engaged with, thought about, argued with, right through from the Hellenistic period. Lots of different physicians engage with it. Pretty much all of the serious Hippocratic commentators of the Roman period write commentaries on it, or at least lecture on it in some senses. It's translated into Latin in late antiquity, into Arabic in medieval Baghdad, back into Latin again from the Arabic, that's this time in the 11th century, to go into the European university system. Knocks around in sort of Latin and various different sort of vernacular forms, then is sort of really fully translated from the Greek in the 18th century and participates in the revival of neo-Hippocratism and debates surrounding different kind of currents in the 18th century medical world. And I could go on, but I think I've made my basic point about this is a really important text, whichever way you look at it. Now, the treatise itself comes in two parts, which is where this slide comes in. The first part systematically outlines the effects of the seasons, the changes between the seasons, the winds, local waters, and location, in particular the orientation of a city and how we understand orientation of a city, we will think about as we go, but also the kind of general terrain of the place. So the effect of all of those different factors on human bodies, with an additional nod to lifestyle as well. So what people eat and drink, and the kind of exercise, how active they are, and so on. So, as I say, systematic about this, and the point is, as the first line of the treatise says, is the author is making the claim that this is what anybody who wants to really be on top of medicine needs to know. You need to know these factors to be the master of the medical art. And then the further conceit is that if a medical practitioner does understand these matters, then on arriving in any new place, by assessing these factors, they will have an immediate grip on local illnesses and the somatic state of the inhabitants. They will, the author confidently says, be able to work out appropriate therapies easily with fewer mistakes, and they will be aware of what general, even universal diseases will break out in the community as the seasons change, and also what the results of you yourself changing your lifestyle might be within that broader context. So that's the first part. The second part, which begins at chapter 12, is going to show how Asia and Europe differ from each other in all respects, and particularly in the form of the peoples. So this is a much more general and abstract discussion. It's of less direct practical applicability, and so it was of less interest to ancient physicians reading it to focus their attention on the first half, and in some cases actually only wrote commentaries on the first half, whereas more modern scholarship has decided the first half was rather boring and dull and repetitive, and was really focused on the second general part and its so-called environmentally determinist explanation for various physical and character traits of different peoples, those living in Europe and Asia, or more specific groups such as the Scythians, who we will get to know quite well as we go along. Needless to say, the environmental determinism is not what As Water Spaces is all about, as will become clear. And this is so that you understand what the difference between Europe and Asia might be. This is a rough guess at a kind of map. This is from Hecateus, who's a historian writing, or it's reconstructed from his fragmentary works, writing around the same time, so very late 5th century BCE. And just so that you understand, this is all Europe, this is all Asia. And Ayres Waters Places agrees that Libya and Egypt are in Asia. And the dividing line goes differently, but Ayres Waters Places wants the Lake Maeotis, which is the Sea of Azov, to be the dividing line. And those are the Scythians up there in the north. As I said, we will meet them in more detail as we go. So the increased focus on the environment has led to some general re-engagement with Ayres Waters Places, or AWP, as I will also call it. Alison Bashford and Sarah Tracy's edited Bulletin of the History of Medicine special issue in 2012, I think, was quite pioneering in this respect, and renewed and expanded interest in racial exploitation and oppression in pre-modern as well as modern contexts has also put the spotlight on Ayres Waters Places. So challenges to and the eventual overthrow of the AWP model, if you like, in which bodies and diseases are shaped by local conditions and will therefore be reshaped by moving, so that if you put yourself in different local conditions for a sustained period of time, that will reshape your body and you will be subject to different sorts of diseases. That's, if you like, the ancient model. That's challenged and then overthrown by, in the kind of process of constructing the new modern race medicine and race science in the 18th and 19th century. And Suman Seth's recent book, is an important example of showing very clearly some of the processes involved in that shift. So, and in addition to which, the kind of interest in pre-modern race and racial oppression has been picked up on, and it's a very lively debate now going on in the ancient world, which again has dipped into Ayres Waters Places and the ideas that are part of it. And if you want an example of that, the edited volume by Denise McCoskey in one of those Bloomsbury kind of massive series, Cultural History of Race, and the Antiquity volume is quite a good glimpse of where we're at in terms of those debates and the kind of scholarly developments within that context. So renewed attention definitely to Ayres Waters Places, and you'd have thought that theories of reproduction or of generation, to give it a more appropriate pre-modern term, and heredity would clearly have a very critical role in these different sorts of stories. So in the distinction between what you might call, rather simplistically, a kind of externally driven or shaped model of racial differentiation, of physical and mental divergence between peoples, on the one hand, it's kind of Ayres Waters Places model, and an internally driven one, a model of differentiation that was eventually to be defined by reproduction and heredity. So you'd have thought spotlight on heredity generation, but actually, apart from noting that the author of AWP argues for the inheritance of acquired characteristics, little attention has really been paid to this dimension of ancient understanding and explanation. And in a way, what people have done is they've picked up the sense in which Ayres Waters Places has been fitted into much longer kind of histories of heredity. And they said, okay, so we call it inheritance of acquired characteristics. That does all the work. Let's get on with the things that we're more interested in. So there hasn't been the sort of exploration in detail of the text itself and where it sits in terms of, is this a representative of broader reasoning? What sorts of assumptions that are shared or not shared in the historical context? So I think, given all of this, given that it's not as if the environment has faded out of interest, but we also now know more clearly that talking about environment can be talking about lots of very different things. I think the time has come to re-examine these themes in Airs, Waters, Places, which is what I'm going to share with you today, or to share part of. And as I say, my idea is to have you help me, because I can do some of the ancient bits, but I'm hoping that you can help broaden the discussion in various different sorts of ways. So just two things to say about my re-examination, one of which is that I do think we need to keep the whole treatise in view, the first and the second halves, because some people are rather worried about the sort of abrupt change from the first to the second half. But actually a number of key themes, concerns and models, certain sorts of patterns of explanation and understanding and indeed writing definitely go right across the piece and give the treatise its coherence and systematicity. And I would argue that one of these themes is generation. This is really a key concern of this author. Fundamental concern about having healthy children is one that really drives a lot of medical inquiry and medical practice in the ancient world. And that's very obvious in this text, but it's very obvious in various different sorts of ways. So that's one thing. And the second thing is that, as I say, I think that we have to, or at least I have to start in the ancient world and then reach out, rather than saying, can we find something that looks a bit like what the market's doing, and go back into the ancient world. So as I say, I'm going to start in the ancient world and reach out from there in terms of what connections and what disconnections are apparent. Okay, so to illustrate my first point, if you like, that generation and fertility is foregrounded throughout this treatise, and to give you a kind of feel of the text and the role the environment plays in it more broadly, because it's a treatise that I think is more, even amongst people who spend a lot of their time reading Greek texts, it's less read than cited. Here's a way of getting a bit of a feel of what's going on. This is the opening part of the opening sequence of statements about cities, polis, which are situated in certain sorts of atmospheric climatic conditions, mostly interested in their relationship to certain winds, but also talks about waters and other areas of environment as well. And the text is going to go systematically through various different possibilities. And it's going to start here with a city that faces south into prevailing hot winds, that's sheltered from cold north winds. The author says that that entails various certain watery configurations, and that it will be hot in summer and cold in winter. And this setup will give the inhabitants moist and phlegmatic heads, and then the phlegm is going to flow down into the cavities. Not quite sure what cavities are, but they come up a lot in this text. And it makes the inhabitants, flabby with poor appetites, a little head for drink. And then we get the bit that's actually quotation. So the local diseases are the following. First, the women are sickly and subject to fluxes. Then many are childless, atocus, from disease, not by nature, while miscarriages are frequent. The children are subject to convulsions and shortness of breath and various other bad things. The men suffer from dysenteries, diarrheas, agues, chronic fevers in winters, and various other bad things. I thought there's enough bad things, you don't need all of them. And universal, these pankoinon disease may occur from the change of the seasons. And then if we carry on through the kind of catalogue, the opposite situation, so facing northerly winds, protected from southerly winds, is even worse for women. So as for the women, first many of them become barren through the waters being hard, refractory and cold. I'm not quite sure what refractory water is, but I don't know how else this is one translation of the Greek. It's certainly hard and cold. Since their purgings do not occur monthly as customary, but are scanty and troublesome, childbirth is difficult, though miscarriage is rare. When they do give birth, they are unable to nourish their children, since their milk dries up because of the hardness and refractoriness of the water. Phthisis, so this consumption, often comes on after their deliveries or after childbirth, because they've had to work so hard at it. And in case you're worried that all women in the ancient world are doomed, there is a good situation that you can be in. So the good situation is facing east, broadly speaking, facing towards the settings of the sun. which is a well-balanced city, a city that has all the different kind of conditions in moderation, will have good waters, and we're told everybody is healthier and brighter and happier. And so we have the ideal generative situation. This is what every city wants, which is that the women are very prolific, they give birth frequently and easily. And if we think a little bit, so this is very descriptive, it's not really giving you direct causation, if you like. There's a kind of implicit model, which, or the bit that's reasonably explicit, is the balance is best. Moderation, being in the middle between all things, that's the best scenario, of course. That's true across the Hippocratic corpus, across Greek culture more broadly. But there's also a kind of model in which the first south-facing people were kind of flabby and fluid, which means that there's the kind of there's miscarriages and births don't happen at the sort of the flowing out isn't going right. There's too much flowing and not enough. So you can sort of think about that. And then the other people are dry, it's kind of dry and hard, so we don't get enough menstruation. Birth is difficult, the milk dries up. So there's a kind of explanatory pattern, if you like. But broadly speaking, this whole sequence specifies for each city, for each, then going to talk about each different sort of water, and then it's going to specify local diseases for men, women, children, quite often the elderly, and then everybody. So there are some things that everybody will be affected by, particularly these kind of epidemic outbreaks that happen seasonally. And for women, broadly, what they're going to be talking about is generation fertility. That is what comes under that heading. And then, as I say, it's going to continue thinking about going through the different sorts of waters and seasons, not quite so systematically. And in those cases, sometimes women can be ill from things that don't necessarily affect generation, but nonetheless, the kind of theme of fertility and generation absolutely goes right across the piece. And then if we go into the second half, as I promised you, we're going to see a little bit of the Scythians, who are, so it's a mix. The second half is this mix of very wide generalizations and then some more specific things about particular peoples who are living in Asia or Europe, or in fact both. And one of the specific peoples, although they're quite a large group of people, are the Scythians, a collective name for nomadic steppe peoples who, according to this author, have a very distinctive and pretty uniform lifestyle and live in an environment dominated by cold, where the seasons hardly alter. So the Scythians have been put up here. They are to the north of the Black Sea, certainly, and they are nomadic. Lots of nice, lots of, I don't know if any of you saw Gold of the Steppes, some amazing craft work of various different sorts that they are responsible for. So we are told when we get a description of their lifestyle, which is not unlike the same description that we would find in something like Herodotus. There's definitely overlap there. And then Airs-Waters Places is going to tell us about the more specific descriptions in response about seasons and form. So we're told that the Scythian race, the Scythicon Genos, is very different from the rest of humanity, while all resembling each other, like the Egyptian race. Sadly, the bits on the Egyptians dropped out of the text and had actually dropped out by the time Galen was reading it in the 2nd century CE. So we don't have the description of the Egyptians and why they're all like each other. They're definitely not cold, they're hot, but apart from that, that's it in terms of what survives. And the Scythians are the least prolific, the least fertile, and the territory supports the least wild animals in both size and number. So again, we're talking about general people, and generation and fertility is very much part of the overall description. And we do also get a series of causes, explanations for this, which this time involve both men and women. So the Scythian men have very little desire or energy for intercourse because of their wet nature, the coldness and softness of their cavities, their insides, and too much horse riding. Too much horse riding and wearing trousers is really bad for you, turns out. And then the women are incapable of holding the seed in their wombs because their flesh is wet and fatty, their menstruation is poor, and they lead an idle and soft life. While the men are doing all the horse riding, the women are in these covered wagons, and they just lie about in these covered wagons all day, all night. They don't do anything at all. And that means that they're not only soft, but they have this fat kind of blocks the mouth of the womb. So there's no way the seed isn't, it's just not going to work in terms of the seed getting into or being held in the womb. And the author makes the point that this is definitely about lifestyle because, and idleness in terms of the women, because he makes a comparison with those between the Scythian women and those who are enslaved women amongst the Scythians, who work very hard, are very active, are very lean, and become pregnant very easily. So just to make the point at the beginning that we're not necessarily talking about environmental determinism. So, but this interest in generation and fertility, as I say, goes all the way through. And we can go up a level of generality back to our beginning of Airs, Waters, Places 12 and this switch to Asia and Europe differing from each other. Where again, we can see that broadly speaking, fertility, generation are part of the agenda. And we're in a world in which we're going to be talking really quite generally. So this is the point of the switch from the local diseases to these global differences, which the author is going to go on to elaborate in various different ways. And this is the first move in which we're told that everything grows to be much more beautiful and impressive in Asia, and we mean plants and people. That the harvests are plentiful, both wild plants and cultivated plants. That the cattle flourish, they give birth frequently and nourish fine offspring. And the people are also well nourished, large and beautiful in form, and pretty homogeneously so. They're also similar to each other. They're gentler and more cultivated, but lacking in courage, industry, and spirit, which I will come back to. And the explanation for all of this is that this is a region of good balance. And this key term here is crasis, mixture of the qualities, mixture of the seasons. And we're told that it's because Asia lies towards the east, which is always good, and further away from the cold. So everything, growth and cultivation of everything occurs best when no single force predominates, but equal parts of all hold power. So that's one of the points. The other points that is made and is going to turn out to be quite important is that there's no real difference between the seasons. So we're balanced and the seasons are pretty much of a muchness. Whereas in Europe, there is greater variation in respects to both lands and seasons. In particular, there's very dramatic contrast in the seasons. And that makes people and animals more varied too, and makes the people more warlike and angry, which I will come back to, as I said. But more important for my purposes is the first effort of the author to illustrate this point about diversity and variation, which comes from the longheads, the macrocephaloi, who are, we are told, the author says, have unique heads on account of the interplay of nature and custom, physis and nomos. And this is the first time that we get the term nomos. Obviously, physis and nomos, very tacit, is a key dyad in ancient Greek thought, and nature and custom or culture or whatever you want to translate it. They're both terms that are quite hard to translate, and indeed they clearly have a specific meaning within their context as well, because physis, this is a normative as well as a physical nature. Physis can be normative as well as kind of about the innate nature of things. And in a sense, although what we've been looking at so far has been looked very physical and mostly been about physis, and has on occasion talked about the natures, we had the cold natures and so on. There clearly has been a bit of culture in there in terms of people's lifestyle and things like that, but now it's made very explicit. And we're going to get a story about how the two are entangled in various ways. So the story goes, so we're talking about these long heads as no other people, and at the beginning it was the law that had the greatest influence on the length of their heads. But now nature too contributes to law. And the story goes that these people, called the long heads, believed that the longer your head, the more noble you were. So they, as soon as the baby was born, well, their nomos was, their custom was that as soon as the baby was born, so while the skull is still very soft, they shaped the head with, first of all, hands and then bandages and then possibly other implements to make it less round and longer. And like many of the stories that we see in Herodotus and As Waters Places, people originally thought making it up. But then we find archaeological evidence that in fact quite a lot of the peoples are doing some of the things that are talked about. And in particular, there is a lot of skull modification that goes on in steppe peoples in Central Asia, and then peoples in Central and Eastern Europe as well. Patchy Bronze Age, Late Iron Age, then Late Antiquity, and different sorts of techniques, but it's definitely a thing. And there are some communities in the late antique sort of area around Hungary and places like that, where 90%, when they look at the burials, like 80 or 90% of them have got modified skulls. So the period that we're talking about, the evidence is much patchier, but we certainly can see from the archaeological evidence that this is something that is really, really happening. And the idea is, as the author tells us, that this practice, so binding the head, possibly putting some kind of flat board on it as well, changes nature. So the nomos, the practice, changes nature by force, but after time that new nature becomes embedded and you don't have to intervene, the heads come out that way anyway. And this is where we start to get our inheritance of acquired characteristics and pangenesis coming into the story. The author wants to offer an explanation for this, so we'll go through the explanation. It's not the same as Lamarck, I don't think. And indeed, the pangenesis is not really Darwin either, but we can think about the comparison. I mean, they're sort of responding to some of the same problems, some of the same challenges. So the basic story is that seed, so this is the generative substance of humans, the kind of means through which like begets like, both in the sense of resemblance and that spark of life. So that's what seed does. And pretty much everybody agrees on that that's what seed does, and we call it seed. Once we're beyond that, lots of debate, but everybody would agree that the seed, and in Hippocratic writings generally, seed is produced by both men and women, and it's the same seed and it does pretty much the same work. That's usually articulated, if there's most of the explicit discussions of that would say that clearly, but there's a number of places where it's left very unclear, and we might wonder whether this is one of them or not. And then, so mostly both men and women produce seed, and it's the same seed, and mostly, although this isn't, there are cases where this is contradicted, but mostly it comes more all over the body. All quarters, however you want to translate pantokothen, all quarters, all parts, it's reasonably clear that it's all parts in this case, but it's coming from all over the body. There's one text which says it comes from all fluids and solids parts of the body as well. Healthy from healthy, diseased from diseased. And so that is asserted here simply, the seed comes. And then we get a series of observations, if you like, that from the bald come bald children. So the actual Greek is just giving us plurals. So whether it's children from bald people, bald. from the bald come bald, from the grey-eyed come grey-eyed, from those who with squints come people with squints. These are all, I'm not sure that they would be defined as disease, but they're all not ideal. Don't really like grey eyes, for example, just to speak on something that affects me sort of more personally. Whether or not they, as I say, whether they count as disease, I'm not sure, but they're making the point that this is not necessarily ideal. So if you've got that situation, long heads can come from long heads, surely. Though they don't anymore, we're told, owing to intercourse with other people, and this could be sexual intercourse with people who don't have long heads, but actually talks about the nomos having shifted rather than the physis, although the physis is following. So maybe the interaction with other peoples is to do with them not prizing long heads in the same way. Homilia could be either, both social intercourse and sexual intercourse, maybe it's both. Physis and nomos are definitely entangled with each other here. And these are arguments that can be found elsewhere in the Hippocratic corpus. And actually, in this case, they can be found almost exactly the same. There's lots of sort of echoes in other texts, but there is almost exactly the same argument in on sacred disease, which is the text that talks about a series of conditions which would surely have included epilepsy, but other diseases involving fits and kind of convulsions, and which argues that this is a disease that's no more or less sacred than any other, and therefore is interested in explaining what the natural causes of it are. And this is the part where the cause is quite complicated, but right at the beginning of the cause, or the kind of causal set of processes, is that its origin lies in heredity, Egenis, through families, through parents, inheritance. As I say, that's part of a longer process, but we have that at the beginning, and then we've got again phlegmatic begets phlegmatic, bilious begets bilious, consumptive from consumptive, splenetic from splenetic. Then if, and here we are clear that it's either mother or father, so if either the mother or the father suffers from the sacred disease, then why not that, or they can certainly pass that on to one of their children. And again, we get this statement because the seed comes from every part of the body, healthy seed from healthy parts, disease from disease. Now, the so-called sacred disease kind of has its seat in the head, in the brain. So too much phlegm, back to the people who had too much phlegm in their heads, but they have too much phlegm in their heads and it kind of clogs up the system in various ways. And there is a kind of issue here where for the macrocephaloi, it's all to do with the head. For in the sacred disease, the idea is that or if you think about it, these people from phlegmatic parents, you get phlegmatic children. Initially, you would think that's about overall balance of the body. You wouldn't think that's to do with a particular part. You would think that they've got too much phlegm, they're a bit too, in terms of the humours. And in a way, that's kind of the model of it on the sacred disease, that you've sort of got too much phlegm and it kind of, in some cases, gets to the head. And if you don't address it quickly enough, then it will get worse and so on. And that seems a slightly different model from the healthy, what the explanation that, or the work that this idea that the seed is coming from all the different parts of the body is doing. So I think sets up whereas in the first case, very clearly focused on parts, you know, grey eyes, long heads. Here, a somewhat different pattern, and indeed a somewhat different explanation about the disease. And indeed, actually, the model of acquisition of shared or of acquired characteristics is actually seems to be contradicted in the case of the Sauromatae, who are a Scythian group living around Lake Maeotis, who we are told by the author, before marriage, the women ride and they fight on horseback, they arrows and spears and all sorts of things. And then after they've killed 3 enemies, they can marry, at which point they're meant to retire from combat, unless there's a kind of emergency, in which case they go back into the field. And they have no right breasts since their mothers cauterize it after birth. And the idea is that all the strength is therefore concentrated in their right shoulder and arm to make them better at fighting. And this picks up on other stories about Amazons, broadly speaking, in that part of the world. Herodotus places the Amazons, they mix the Sauromatae, half Amazon, half Scythian, various different kind of stories that we get, and other people tell us about the cutting off of the right breast. In some cases, it's to ensure that you're better at the bow. The breast doesn't get in the way. One of the things that's also pointed out is that actually, although it's quite hard to see whether these Amazonian women have any breasts at all, they don't usually get depicted. That is certainly not, that they've only got one breast is not part of the depiction of Amazons, who are normally presented as rather kind of beautiful and conventionally looking women. But anyway, the point here is that they clearly keep having to do this. It doesn't, there's no inheritance of the acquired characteristic, but maybe that's because if it's only one sex, it doesn't work. I kind of wonder about that. But I guess one of the things that's interesting about both of these cases is that what's happening is that cultural decisions are being made, cultural decisions that we value long heads, or cultural decisions that the women are going to fight, which then lead to body modifications. It's not that the body doesn't start the process, or the environment doesn't start the process. A cultural decision is made and then implemented. And there's one other kind of contradiction, or a sort of difference in perspective in all of this on acquired characteristics and whether or not they can be passed on at all, or whether any characteristics can be passed on at all. This is my kind of last case. So back to the Scythians, and I mentioned that the author comments on the homogeneity of the people, that they are, he's got this eye in general about whether people are the same as each other or different, or this kind of internal variation. And it said that's because the seasons are the same, which means that there's no loss or corruption in the coagulation of the seed, except as the result of some violent event or disease. Actually, it turns out that it's because they all share the same climatic conditions, cold, they all share the same lifestyle, and the seasons change a little. But it's this point about the seasons and its effect on seed that seems crucial in respect to generation and the possibility of transmitting any kind of characteristics between generations. And this point is very much underlined once we talk about the rest of the population of Europe. So the author points out again, as I said this on a couple of occasions, but points it out more systematically here, that the peoples in Europe differ or in both size and form from each other. They are inhabitants of Europe are characterized by variation, internal diversity, which is because of the changes in the seasons being extreme and frequent, severe heat waves, severe winters, copious rains, long droughts, lots of different sorts of wind, and that this has some kind of impact on the generation through the coagulation sympexis bit difficult. So that's a word that certainly means some kind of coming together, but whether it's condensation, whether it's the coming together of the seed in a single individual, maybe less clear. But something is happening to the seed, which is making it variable. And it varies a lot. And it's that we're told that the seed is sympexis of the seed is not the same in the same person in summer as in winter, nor in rain as in drought. And then this is why people living in Europe vary more than people living in Asia. And even for people living in Europe, their size can vary within a single city. They can be varied. But there are more faults or losses, destructions, thori in the coagulation of the seed when the changes of the seasons are frequent than when they're close and similar. So we've got this rather unstable generation going on at this point, and it also affects character. The same principle applies. This makes people wild, unsociable, and impetuous. So they've got these frequent shocks to the mind, which imparts wildness. So rather than being gentle and civilized like those who live in Asia, they're wild and unsociable. And also, I said I was going to come back to why people in Asia are less courageous than those in Europe. It also speaks to their courageousness, because if you've got a stable situation, you could become complacent, and that means cowardice. Whereas if you're lots of changes, then you're really active and you become brave and courageous, but it can also spill over into being impetuous and warlike. And then we also have the point, which is this reason the inhabitants of Europe are more warlike, but it's also because of their nomoi, since they are not subject to kings as those living in Asia are. So thus, as I said above, where people are subject to kings, they must be more cowardly, because if men's minds are enslaved, they refuse to run risks readily and recklessly in order to increase the power of someone else. And this is referring back to possibly the most famous line in Airs, Waters, Places, where he's been talking about the different variations, but really says actually nomoi are the most important. You can have the same sorts of people in the same kind of situation, but if you have different nomoi, and you can tell this because all inhabitants of Asia, whether Greeks or barbarians, who are not subject to a ruler but are self-governed and exert themselves to their own advantage, they're the most warlike. So they're living next to people in exactly the same situation, exactly the same environment and the same people. So both Greeks and barbarians, doesn't matter whether or not you're Greek, but if you're ruled by a king, part of the Persian Empire, you will be not very warlike. But if you're not ruled by a king, you will be one of the most warlike people that is around. So nomos is the most important. Aristotle didn't entirely agree with some of this. So to finish then, as I think I've shown, this isn't environmental determinism by any stretch of the imagination. It's a much more complex system with many moving parts, which the author is not really particularly interested in really clearly joining up. Targeted explanations which bring in a number of different factors. Some points they kind of fit together and are in a kind of virtuous loop. Sometimes they look more messy. Doesn't seem to be and certainly not interested in kind of building a clear hierarchy where you start from the very bottom. These are the most fundamental, and we go up from that. The environment certainly, and we're thinking about seasons, we're thinking about winds, we're thinking about location in a somewhat odd sense, because it is about orientation. At one point in the first part, the author says, cities only need to be a stadium distance apart from each other to be completely different. So it's not sort of, there are ancient Greek texts that talk much more about how north and how south you are, the location much more clearly. This is very much more topographical in various senses. So winds, location, waters, all important, seasons are important, shape people and animals and plants. So we're sort of in a kind of early One Health model, if you like, all having some kind of impact. We don't seem to have much impact of the humans on the environment. The only point at which that's mentioned is people in Asia were very good at turning wild plants into cultivated plants, but that's about it. And there are various, you do have some choices about how exactly you respond to your environment in terms of drinking water and so on, although sometimes you don't, and particularly if you live in a marsh and you kind of have to drink the marshy water, then you're in quite serious trouble in all sorts of ways. But there's no suggestion, or there doesn't seem to be much interest in impact or intervention by humans on that environment. And there's a kind of question which is about, so they're interested in, there's a further point of interest, which I think is about what effects does the environment have? So what are they picking, what is this author picking up on? Pick up on issues like homogeneity of a people and diversity of a people. Are probably erring towards diversity being good, but it's not really quite clear, I think. With very general kind of shape and size, well-nourished, not. There's only one mention of skin colour, which is that the Scythians are red, which is not really because they're burnt by the sun, but is because that various things are coming through their white skin because of the cold. But that's the only, there's nothing about different sorts of hair or anything like that. None of the things that we would think of that will become particular sorts of markers in that kind of context. And it's very vague. You know, we've got certain sorts of characteristics, courage, industry, but it's quite messy in terms of what seems to be being picked up on. But I think one of the key themes that is picked up on is generation. That issue of fertility, it is clear, emphatic that the environment affects fertility and affects generation, and indeed that your ability to be able to transmit or thinking about transmission of various physical properties is impacted by the environment, and possibly quite often disrupted by the environment, which may be why we come back to culture. That is more controllable in some ways. The humans can make decisions and then implement them at that level, which is in some senses much harder to do at an environmental, in the kind of environmental context, or the physical things can be impacted by culture, and that's more controllable. But I will see what people from different times and places, as it were, make of all of that. Thank you very much for your attention.